Libya. How did it come together? And is it staying together? Maybe not. Joining me now to discuss just that issue is Ted Galen Carpenter. Ted is a senior fellow in security studies at the Cato Institute and a contributing editor at the American Conservative. Ted Galen Carpenter, welcome to Counterpoint.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda.
How did Libya come about?
Well, Libya was especially an artificial creation. I mean, it was basically when Italy managed to take some territory from the decaying Ottoman Empire in World War I, Rome cobbled together three rather different provinces of the old Ottoman Empire, and that became the new colony for Italy. The victorious Allies in World War II, when it stripped Italy and the other Axis powers of their colonies, kept Libya intact as the Italians had put it together. But it never had that much in common. And in fact, very sharp east-west rivalry between those two regions.
So where are we now?
In the midst of a civil war. One thing about Colonel Gaddafi, I mean, a terribly brutal man, terribly vicious leader, but he did keep Libya intact. When the United States and its NATO allies overthrew Gaddafi, basically helping one faction, the faction that dominated the eastern part of Libya, when Gaddafi was ousted, Libya became essentially Somalia on the Mediterranean. Total chaos, numerous rival militias fighting it out. And eventually that coalesced around 2016, 2017, into a two-way fight between the government that was recognized by the international community, one that is almost laughingly called the Government of National Accord. And then in the east of Libya, an insurgent movement arose with a one-time CIA asset, General Khalifa Haftar, taking control. That forced the Libyan National Army gain control of the entire eastern part of Libya and then moved in 2019 against the capital at Tripoli. It failed to take Tripoli, though, and in fact, Haftar's forces have been pretty much repulsed from Tripoli. So the country is, at this point, pretty much divided on a de facto basis between East and West. And there's some indication that General, or as he calls himself, Field Marshal Haftar, is thinking about just trying to rule over the East. He's still making an effort to take Tripoli, but since that's failing, this might be his fallback position. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for the country if it would end the fighting, since the eastern and western portions don't have that much in common. They've never liked each other. Under Gaddafi, several rebellions arose, all of them starting in the east. Gaddafi based his support in the west. So this might be more naturally two countries rather than one to begin with.
What about aid or support from other countries? Is that all to the existing government, or is there some support for the LNA from outsiders?
Amanda, this is almost beginning to resemble the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, where you had outside powers backing one side or the other when General Franco eventually came to power, winning that civil war. Here you have Turkey especially backing the internationally recognized government, pouring financial and military aid into Tripoli. The Qatar government doing much the same. And then on the other side, you have countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates supporting Haftar and his forces. So it is a thoroughgoing mess. It has become a plaything of international power politics. And the poor Libyan people have been suffering so much since the chaos began in 2011, continue to suffer grievously. You've had literally hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Libya, mostly going to Europe. You've had tens of thousands killed in the fighting over the past nearly a decade now.
You're on RN, this is Counterpoint, and I'm Amanda Vanstone. I'm talking to Ted Galen Carpenter. He's a senior fellow in security studies at the Cato Institute and a contributing editor at the American Conservative. And I think we're in pretty much fulsome agreement that outside meddling in countries doesn't work, and we're talking about Libya at this point. It must be a terrible thing. It's almost inconceivable to me to really understand, or to be able to say that I can feel, if you know what I mean, what it would be like to be in a country where you felt that outside players had all the control and that what you thought and how you wanted to be governed didn't really make much difference. It was more a question of where Turkey or Arab states or the United States or somebody would put their money. And it certainly does lead, I hope, people to say, how can we end this? And you're saying the one way to end it is to divide it up. So my question is, what about the spoils? How are you going to divide up Libya's oil production?
It's not so much divided up. I think the contending parties may be doing that themselves. And I think the international players ought to accept that result. I don't like the idea of an imposed partition. I think that situation...
Yeah, I agree with that. That's just outside is not real, it's not wanted by the people, and generally doesn't work. But how will the players, even if these areas are sort of recognised now as separate areas amongst the people, what would they decide about the oil production? Who would get the money?
That's the toughest issue. There's no question about that. As things look now, Haftar and his faction would probably control a majority of the oil resources. But there would be at least a modest amount available to the government in Tripoli and the western portion of Libya. There's not going to be any perfect solution to this. That's utterly impossible. But outside meddling, starting with the United States and its NATO allies, and then joined in by other Middle Eastern powers especially, that kind of meddling has made things much, much worse than it would have been even leaving Gaddafi in power. So I think the outsiders need to finally learn the lesson, stop meddling. They're not going to end up gaining all that much. And in the meantime, they're causing enormous suffering for the Libyan people.
Ted, given this is, in a sense, history repeating itself, and given we presumably have in our governments and in foreign affairs departments some very bright people, why haven't we internationally learnt that lesson already? That imposed solutions from outside, meddling, in the end, doesn't last.
It's an excellent question, Amanda. Unfortunately, I think there's an activist bias, a desire to try to take action to create the result that policymakers would like, rather than, as I put it very often, let bad enough be alone. Let it alone. It can get worse. And the kind of outside meddling that we've seen in Libya, and frankly that we've seen in Syria, clearly that kind of meddling has managed to make things much, much worse.
That's not a happy note to leave on, Ted, but I think we've said what needs to be said, and I thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Amanda.